Tonight, we're diving into a really interesting conversation about Israel, its history, its biblical significance, and what's going on there right now. We'll also touch on topics related to Judaism. For the first part, my friend and I will chat about these things, sharing our insights and experiences. Then, in the second half, we'll open it up for your questions. You can text them in at any time, and we'll answer them towards the end of the session. So, let's get started. Ronnie's journey to Israel is one of those stories you couldn't make up, even if you tried. It starts in the early 70s, back when he was a young man searching for meaning, not quite knowing where he was headed, but knowing he needed something different. Born and raised in New York, Ronnie had a typical Jewish upbringing, but I wouldn't say it was deeply religious. Like many in his community, his connection to Judaism was more cultural than spiritual. He had his bar mitzvah, sure, but it was more of a social event than a deeply transformative moment. He wasn't really practicing, and Israel, well, it wasn't something on his radar. He wasn't running away from anything, just looking for something. It was more about finding himself than finding a homeland. In the early 70s, he set off on what many would call the hippie trail, traveling through Europe, Turkey, Afghanistan, and India. Ronnie was in his early 20s, and this journey was more about escaping the monotony and trying to figure out who he was. He wasn't even thinking about Israel, Judaism, or anything related to his heritage. He was living the typical young traveler's dream, searching, learning, growing, but still not quite settled. After spending several months in India, he realized he wasn't finding the answers he was looking for. In fact, he felt more lost than ever. So, like many people at some point in their lives, Ronnie found himself in a bit of a crisis. He wasn't sure what his next step was. It wasn't just about his travels, it was about finding direction, purpose. One of those moments of destiny, the kind you can never plan, happened when he was in Turkey in February 1974. It was a snowstorm. He had nowhere to go, and he was broke. He was at a low point in his travels. And then, in this kind of desperate moment, he met a woman on a boat in Italy. This woman, without knowing it, gave him a piece of advice that would change his life. She handed him an address of a kibbutz in Israel. She said, "Whenever you find yourself desolate, go to Israel. They'll take you in. You can make some money there, and you might just find what you're looking for." At the time, Ronnie thought little of it, but the address stayed with him. The next thing you know, he's standing on the shores of the Sea of Galilee, a volunteer at Kibbutz Aon. Now, let me tell you, kibbutz life is nothing like you'd expect. It's communal, simple, and deeply rooted in a shared work ethic. Ronnie was a city guy. New York was his world, and here he was, living in the Israeli countryside. It was the exact opposite of his usual lifestyle. The people there were warm and welcoming, but he was still a stranger, someone on the outside looking in. The work was physically demanding hard, manual labor. It wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't easy, but it was real. Everyone on the kibbutz worked together, growing crops, taking care of livestock, and contributing to the community. For Ronnie, this was a complete shift. He wasn't just working for himself or a paycheck. He was contributing to something larger than himself. It was a strange kind of fulfillment. But here's where it gets interesting. Ronnie wasn't a religious man, but something about Israel, about this place, started to stir something in him. He wasn't there because of a religious calling. He wasn't looking for a spiritual awakening. He was there because he had nowhere else to go. But the longer he stayed, the more he began to feel that there was something important about this place, something he couldn't quite put his finger on yet. Israel wasn't just another stop on his travels, it was becoming a part of him. The more time he spent there, the more he started to feel like this was a place he could call home. At this point, Ronnie had been on the kibbutz for a while, but his status was still that of a volunteer. He had no official ties to Israel beyond his Jewish background. And then, something changed. One day, someone on the kibbutz told him that his situation would change if he decided to become an official Israeli citizen. You see, Israel has a law called the Law of Return, which grants automatic citizenship to any Jew who moves to the country. You don't have to prove your Jewishness beyond your heritage, and Ronnie's last name Cohen was enough. He had a deep connection to this land, even if he hadn't realized it yet. So, Ronnie did it. He went to the Ministry of the Interior in Tiberias and signed the papers. Just like that, he was an Israeli citizen. It was a surprisingly simple process. It wasn't filled with the bureaucracy or the difficulty he expected. It was almost too easy, but that simplicity was part of what made it so profound. Ronnie didn't have to prove himself. He didn't have to jump through any hoops. His connection to Israel was enough. This newfound citizenship marked a turning point. Ronnie's life at the kibbutz began to shift. He was no longer just a volunteer. He was a full-fledged member of the community. He got his own room, which, let me tell you, was a big deal compared to the cramped space he'd been sharing with 3 other guys. He had air conditioning. It was a small thing, but to him, it felt like a huge improvement. He wasn't just part of the kibbutz anymore. He was part of Israel. This was his new home. But the changes didn't stop there. A few months later, Ronnie received a letter in Hebrew. Now, Ronnie didn't read Hebrew at the time, but he took the letter to the kibbutz secretary, who translated it for him. The letter, as it turns out, was informing him that he was required to serve in the Israeli army. It wasn't something Ronnie had planned on, but it was part of the deal when you become a citizen. Every Israeli citizen, no male or female, has to serve in the army. It didn't matter that Ronnie had just arrived in Israel, he was now a part of this country, and that meant fulfilling his duty to it. At first, Ronnie wasn't thrilled about the idea. He wasn't there to be a soldier, but he also knew it was a rite of passage, so he did his time. And although it was tough, it became another chapter in his Israeli experience. When you think about Ronnie's journey, it's remarkable how much it mirrors the experiences of so many people who make Aliyah. He wasn't seeking a religious awakening. He wasn't looking to fulfill some deep cultural need. He was simply looking for something, and Israel provided that. It gave him a sense of belonging, a connection to his roots, and a new community to be a part of. Now, in retrospect, Ronnie's decision to move to Israel wasn't just about a physical relocation. It was a spiritual and cultural shift, too. He wasn't the same person who had boarded that plane in 1974. Israel had changed him in ways he couldn't have predicted. He had gone from being a young man adrift, searching for something, to someone who had found a deep connection to his heritage and a place he could call home. Ronnie's decision to make Aliyah was more than just an immigration process. It was a personal transformation, one that would shape the rest of his life. It wasn't easy. It wasn't without its challenges, but it was meaningful in ways that go beyond words. In many ways, Ronnie's story is the story of Israel itself, a place of profound history, complex identity, and continual transformation. It's a place where people from all walks of life come to find something deeper, something that ties them to the land and to each other. Ronnie found that something, and it wasn't just about making a new home in Israel. It was about finding himself, and that's the kind of story you can't make up. It's the kind of story that happens when you least expect it. The connection between the Jewish people and the land of Israel is deeply woven into the fabric of history, religion, and identity. For thousands of years, the land has been central to Jewish culture, faith, and survival. It's not just a place on the map, it's a cornerstone of the Jewish story. The bond is more than geographical. It's spiritual, historical, and even emotional. But over the years, especially in modern times, the significance of that connection has become a topic of debate, particularly between Jews in Israel and those living abroad, particularly in the United States. To understand this bond, we have to go back to the beginning. The Bible is filled with promises that God made to the Jewish people about the land. From the very first patriarch, Abraham, to the later figures of Moses, Joshua, and King David, the land of Israel is promised as the inheritance for the descendants of Abraham. In the book of Genesis, God tells Abraham, "To your descendants I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates." This promise is one of the foundational pillars of Jewish identity. This is the land where their ancestors lived, the land where God chose to make a covenant with them. For centuries, Jews lived in this land, built cities, and developed a unique culture. However, over time, they were conquered, exiled, and dispersed across the world. The destruction of the first temple, the Babylonian exile, and the Roman conquest were all pivotal moments in Jewish history that led to the dispersion of the Jewish people. Even as Jews were scattered, however, the connection to the land never fully disappeared. For over 2,000 years, Jews prayed facing Jerusalem, the center of the land, yearning to return. The phrase "next year in Jerusalem" became a part of the Passover Seder, symbolizing the hope for a return to their ancestral homeland. But the journey to reclaim this land was long and complicated. The history of Jewish return to Israel in modern times dates back to the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when the Zionist movement began gaining traction. This movement, spearheaded by figures like Theodor Herzl, sought to establish a Jewish homeland in the land of Israel, in part as a response to the rising tide of anti-Semitism in Europe. For Jews living in the diaspora, especially those in Europe, the idea of returning to the land of Israel became not only a spiritual aspiration, but also a political necessity. It was in this context that modern Zionism emerged as a powerful force. The question, though, of how important the land truly is to Jews today is far from simple. Jews living in Israel see the land as an inseparable part of their identity. It is not just a place they live, it is the land that has been central to their people's survival and existence for thousands of years. Israel is viewed by many Jews as the culmination of their collective return to their ancestral homeland. It represents the fulfillment of the promises made by God to their ancestors, the place where Jewish sovereignty can flourish again after centuries of oppression. For those who live in Israel, the land is more than just a nation, it is a manifestation of their history, their struggle, and their resilience. However, for Jews living outside of Israel, particularly in the United States, the attachment to the land can be more abstract. Many Jews in the diaspora are incredibly proud of Israel's achievements, but for some, the land itself may not hold the same level of significance. There are several reasons for this difference in perspective. First, for many Jews in America, their connection to Judaism is often more cultural or religious than territorial. They see their identity in terms of tradition, values, and community rather than geography. For them, Israel might be a symbol of Jewish strength and survival, but not necessarily a place they feel personally connected to. In addition, Jews in the United States have generally not had to face the same existential threats that Israeli Jews have experienced. For those living in Israel, the land is often seen as a place of refuge, a sanctuary after centuries of persecution. The survival of the Jewish people in Israel has been a hard-fought battle, especially with the constant threat of violence and conflict from neighboring countries and groups. For many Jews in the US, however, the idea of a Jewish homeland in Israel might not seem as urgent. They may view Israel primarily as a spiritual center or a place of pilgrimage, but they don't necessarily feel the same sense of urgency or necessity to physically live there. This difference in perspective often leads to misunderstandings and differing opinions about the importance of the land. But even within Israel, there are varying opinions about the land and what it truly means. While many Israelis see the land as their rightful inheritance, there is also a complex and sometimes contentious debate about what the land represents, especially in relation to the Palestinians. The question of land ownership, borders, and sovereignty is at the heart of the ongoing Israeli-Palestinian conflict. While Jews believe that the land was promised to them by God, and they point to historical, biblical, and legal claims to support their right to the land, Palestinians also see it as their homeland. They, too, have a deep historical connection to the land, having lived there for centuries before the establishment of Israel. For many Palestinians, the establishment of Israel in 1948 and the subsequent wars that followed led to their displacement and a sense of loss. The debate about the land is further complicated by the competing narratives, with each side holding to its own historical claims. This conflict between the Israeli and Palestinian claims to the land is what makes discussions about the land so difficult. For Jews in Israel, the land is the fulfillment of God's promise to their ancestors, and it is central to their identity and survival. For Palestinians, the land represents the loss of their homes, their culture, and their right to self-determination. The tragedy is that both peoples have valid, deeply rooted claims to the land, and the inability to reconcile these claims has led to decades of conflict. The differences in perspective between Jews in Israel and Jews in the US also reflect different experiences. Israelis live in a country that is constantly dealing with security threats, economic challenges, and political divisions. Their connection to the land is shaped by their daily lives and the challenges they face in maintaining their sovereignty and security. For American Jews, on the other hand, the connection to Israel is often more abstract and symbolic. They see Israel as the Jewish homeland, but their lives are not directly affected by the same issues that Israelis face. As a result, their connection to the land may be more focused on its spiritual and historical significance rather than the practical, everyday realities of living in Israel. In recent years, however, there has been a shift in the way Jews in the US view Israel. Many American Jews, particularly younger generations, have become more engaged in the debate surrounding Israel's policies, especially in relation to the Palestinian issue. There has been a growing sense of frustration among some Jews in the US with Israel's government, particularly with regard to the ongoing occupation of Palestinian territories and the lack of progress toward a two-state solution. This has led to a more complex relationship between Jews in the US and Israel. While many still support Israel and its right to exist as a Jewish state, there is a growing recognition that the relationship between Israel and the Palestinian people must be addressed in order to achieve lasting peace. Ultimately, the connection between the Jewish people and the land of Israel is deeply personal, and it varies greatly depending on one's experiences, beliefs, and perspective. For Jews in Israel, the land is not just a place, it is the heart of their identity, the fulfillment of a promise made thousands of years ago. For Jews in the US, the land holds a symbolic significance, a reminder of their roots, but it may not be as immediate or as urgent. Yet, despite these differences, the bond between the Jewish people and the land remains undeniable. Whether it's through prayer, pilgrimage, or a desire for peace, the land of Israel will always be at the center of Jewish identity, a place where history, faith, and hope converge. The Israel-Palestinian conflict is one of the most complex and enduring struggles in modern history. Its roots stretch back over a century, and to fully understand its current state, we must explore the historical backdrop, particularly the era of the British Mandate and how the relationship between Jews and Arabs evolved over time. The tension between these two communities, which has become emblematic of the conflict today, wasn't always so stark. In fact, Jews and Arabs once lived side by side in relative harmony. But with the arrival of British colonialism and the rise of competing nationalisms, the seeds of discord were sown, eventually leading to the violence and division we see today. The story of Jewish-Arab relations in Palestine begins long before the establishment of Israel. Jews and Arabs have coexisted in the region for centuries, especially during the time of the Ottoman Empire, which ruled over Palestine from the 16th century until the end of World War I. For much of this period, the two communities lived together in relative peace, despite occasional tensions. Both Jews and Arabs were part of a larger Middle Eastern cultural and religious mosaic. Jerusalem, for instance, was a shared city sacred to Jews, Muslims, and Christians alike. While there were periods of conflict and resentment, particularly when foreign empires exerted control over the region, the coexistence of Jews and Arabs in Palestine was marked by cooperation, with both groups working together in various sectors of life, from agriculture to trade. This dynamic began to shift dramatically at the turn of the 20th century, with the rise of nationalism in Europe and the emergence of the Zionist movement. The Zionists, led by figures like Theodor Herzl, sought to establish a Jewish homeland in Palestine, which they saw as their ancestral homeland promised by God. The idea of a return to the land of Israel was, for the Zionists, both a religious calling and a practical solution to the growing anti-Semitism in Europe. Jews, having faced persecution for centuries, saw Palestine as a sanctuary, a place where they could establish a state of their own. The Balfour Declaration of 1917, issued by the British government, promised support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. This declaration was pivotal for the Zionist cause, but it also sowed the seeds of conflict with the Arab population. At the time of the Balfour Declaration, Palestine was part of the Ottoman Empire, but following the Ottoman defeat in World War I, the British took control of the region under a League of Nations mandate. The British were in a difficult position. They had promised the Arabs independence in exchange for their support in the war against the Ottomans, yet they had also committed to supporting the Zionist cause. This contradiction set the stage for tensions between Jews and Arabs in Palestine. For the Arab population, the promise of a Jewish homeland in a land they considered their own was deeply upsetting. While the Jewish community in Palestine was still small, the influx of Jewish immigrants in the 1920s and 1930s, driven by the rise of Nazism and the growing need for a Jewish refuge, fueled resentment among the Arabs. During the British Mandate, relations between Jews and Arabs in Palestine began to deteriorate. In the 1920s and 1930s, violence broke out between the two groups, often fueled by economic competition and nationalist tensions. The 1929 Hebron massacre, in which 67 Jews were killed by Arabs in a violent attack, marked a turning point. This was followed by the Arab Revolt of 1936 to 1939, during which Arabs protested against both British rule and the increasing Jewish presence in Palestine. The British responded with harsh measures, and Jewish groups, like the Haganah, began to form their own defense organizations. By this point, Jewish self-defense became a necessity, and the rift between Jews and Arabs was widening. While there had been moments of cooperation, such as joint efforts in trade or economic ventures, the relationship was now defined more by division and violence. The escalation of tension was further fueled by the growing realization among Jews that their return to Palestine was not simply a spiritual endeavor, but a political one. As Jewish immigration increased, especially in the wake of the Holocaust, the Arab population began to view the Zionist movement as an existential threat. Jews and Arabs both began to claim the same land as their own, and the British found themselves caught between two opposing sides. The British tried to balance their promises to both Jews and Arabs, but this proved impossible. The result was a growing sense of frustration, anger, and a feeling of betrayal on both sides. After World War II, the British, exhausted from years of managing the conflicting interests in Palestine, handed the problem over to the newly formed United Nations. In 1947, the UN proposed a partition plan, which would divide Palestine into two states, one Jewish and one Arab, with Jerusalem placed under international control. The Jewish leadership accepted the plan, seeing it as a path to the establishment of a Jewish state, but the Arab leadership rejected it, unwilling to accept the idea of a Jewish state in what they considered to be Arab land. The rejection of the partition plan by the Arabs set the stage for the violent confrontation that would follow. On May 14, 1948, David Ben-Gurion declared the establishment of the State of Israel. The next day, neighboring Arab countries Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon invaded the newly formed state, hoping to prevent its creation. The 1948 Arab-Israeli War, also known as the War of Independence for Israelis and Nakba, or catastrophe for Palestinians, resulted in an Israeli victory. Despite being vastly outnumbered, the Israeli forces were able to hold their ground and even expand their territory. Over 700,000 Palestinian Arabs fled or were expelled from their homes, leading to a refugee crisis that remains unresolved to this day. The establishment of Israel and the subsequent war created deep animosity and distrust between Jews and Arabs, and the conflict would shape the future of the region for decades to come. The aftermath of the 1948 war left the land divided. Israel controlled much of the territory, including most of the coastal plain, the Galilee, and parts of the Negev Desert. The West Bank, including East Jerusalem, was annexed by Jordan, while the Gaza Strip was controlled by Egypt. The 1949 armistice agreements established borders that were far from permanent, but offered a temporary halt to the fighting. Yet, the displacement of Palestinians and the failure to create a viable Palestinian state set the stage for future conflicts. In the following decades, tensions remained high. In 1956, Israel, alongside Britain and France, launched the Suez Crisis in response to Egyptian President Nasser's nationalization of the Suez Canal. The crisis ended with a ceasefire, but the underlying issues between Israel and its Arab neighbors were far from resolved. In 1967, during the Six-Day War, Israel captured the West Bank, Gaza Strip, East Jerusalem, the Sinai Peninsula, and the Golan Heights. This war fundamentally reshaped the region's map and brought millions of Palestinians under Israeli control. The subsequent Israeli settlement policy, which began building Jewish communities in the occupied territories, only further fueled tensions between Israelis and Palestinians. The decades that followed saw both violence and attempts at peace. In the late 1980s, Palestinians launched the first intifada, or uprising, against Israeli rule in the occupied territories. This rebellion, which involved both peaceful protests and violent clashes, was met with a heavy Israeli military response. In the early 1990s, both sides came to the negotiating table, leading to the Oslo Accords in 1993, which established a framework for a two-state solution. However, these peace efforts were ultimately derailed by violence, failed negotiations, and the assassination of Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin in 1995. The Second Intifada, which began in 2000, was another turning point in the conflict. It was marked by widespread violence, suicide bombings, and Israeli military operations. Since then, the conflict has continued, with multiple flare-ups of violence, a cycle of retaliation, and ongoing disputes over territory, refugees, and the status of Jerusalem. The role of the British Mandate in the origins of the conflict cannot be overstated. Their policies in the early 20th century, particularly the conflicting promises made to both Jews and Arabs, set the stage for decades of conflict. The British tried to maintain control of the region, but ultimately failed to broker a lasting peace. The legacy of the Mandate is felt to this day, as both Israelis and Palestinians continue to claim the land as their own, each side holding on to deeply rooted historical, religious, and cultural ties to the region. Today, the conflict continues to center on issues such as borders, the rights of refugees, the status of Jerusalem, and the establishment of a Palestinian state. The once hopeful dreams of a peaceful coexistence have given way to a situation of deep division, violence, and frustration. While there have been numerous attempts at peace, the road to resolution seems as distant as ever, with each side holding firmly to its narrative of history, its claim to the land, and its vision for the future. The events of 1948 were a defining moment in the history of Israel, a pivotal year that saw the birth of a new nation and the beginning of one of the most remarkable struggles for survival in modern history. Israel's victory in the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, often referred to as the War of Independence by Israelis, was nothing short of miraculous. The odds were stacked heavily against the newly declared state, which was surrounded by hostile Arab nations intent on preventing its creation. Despite being vastly outnumbered, Israel not only survived the war, but managed to expand its borders and solidify its existence as a Jewish state in the heart of the Middle East. On May 14, 1948, David Ben-Gurion, the head of the Jewish Agency, declared the establishment of the State of Israel. The declaration came hours before the British Mandate officially ended, and it marked the fulfillment of the Zionist dream, a Jewish homeland in the land of Israel. However, this historic moment was immediately followed by a military intervention from neighboring Arab countries. The armies of Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, and other Arab states, along with Palestinian Arab militias, launched an invasion of the new state, determined to destroy it before it could take root. The Israeli military, known as the Israel Defense Forces (IDF), was barely in its infancy. It was comprised of inexperienced soldiers, many of whom had been part of underground militias during the British Mandate period, and they faced a formidable enemy that was better equipped, more numerous, and well established. Israel's population, which was only around 600,000 at the time, was no match for the combined forces of the Arab armies, which numbered more than twice that. Yet, despite being outnumbered, outgunned, and facing overwhelming odds, Israel emerged victorious, a victory that stunned the world and set the stage for the establishment of a permanent Jewish presence in the region. Israel's success in the war was due to a combination of factors, including military strategy, determination, and, in many eyes, divine intervention. The victory was seen by many as miraculous, considering the disparity in resources between the two sides. Israel's forces were not only outnumbered, but also lacked the heavy weapons and advanced equipment that the Arab armies possessed. They were up against an enemy that had tanks, artillery, and aircraft, while Israel's military was largely equipped with light arms, makeshift weapons, and whatever they could acquire in the black market. But despite these challenges, the Israelis managed to hold their ground, often outmaneuvering their opponents and using their knowledge of the terrain to their advantage. One of the key factors in Israel's success was the role of the Jewish underground militias that had operated in Palestine before the establishment of the state. Groups like the Haganah, the Irgun, and the Lehi had been fighting for Jewish independence during the British Mandate and had gained valuable experience in guerrilla warfare. The Haganah, in particular, became the core of the new Israeli military. These militias were instrumental in the early days of the war, providing the bulk of Israel's manpower and expertise. They had already been involved in numerous skirmishes with the British, as well as with Arab forces, and they brought a wealth of knowledge and experience to the fight. Another critical factor in Israel's survival was the international support it received after World War II. The Holocaust, which had decimated the Jewish population in Europe, left a deep scar on the world's conscience. The international community, especially the United States and the Soviet Union, was sympathetic to the plight of the Jewish people and recognized the need for a Jewish homeland. The aftermath of the Holocaust played a significant role in garnering support for the establishment of Israel. The global recognition of Israel's right to exist as a sovereign state was critical in the early days of the war, as it gave Israel the moral and diplomatic backing it needed to survive. In addition to diplomatic support, Israel also received crucial military aid. The newly formed state faced significant challenges in acquiring arms, as its access to international weapons markets was limited. But Israel was resourceful, and the Jewish underground had long been engaged in arms smuggling. During the years leading up to 1948, the Jewish community in Palestine worked tirelessly to procure weapons, often through covert operations. One of the most significant sources of arms for the nascent Israeli military came from Czechoslovakia. In the aftermath of World War II, Czechoslovakia, under communist rule, was one of the few countries willing to sell arms to Israel. In 1947 and 1948, Czechoslovakia sent large quantities of arms to the Jewish forces, including rifles, machine guns, and even aircraft. This arms shipment played a pivotal role in enabling Israel to defend itself against the Arab armies. The role of the Jewish underground in arms acquisition cannot be overstated. Before the establishment of Israel, the Jewish community in Palestine had to operate under constant British restrictions. The British authorities had imposed strict limits on Jewish immigration and arms imports, fearing that the Jewish community would use these resources to fight for independence. As a result, Jewish militias were forced to rely on creative and covert methods to acquire weapons. This underground network, which was developed during the British Mandate, became a crucial asset during the War for Independence. The conflict was not only a battle for survival, but also a test of Israel's resolve. The Jewish community in Palestine was fighting for its very existence, and the newly formed state of Israel was determined to defend itself at all costs. The leadership of David Ben-Gurion, who became Israel's first prime minister, was critical in maintaining unity and focus during the war. Ben-Gurion understood that Israel's survival depended on the cohesion of its people and its military. He worked tirelessly to organize and mobilize the population, ensuring that every able-bodied man and woman contributed to the war effort. Ben-Gurion's leadership was a key factor in Israel's ability to withstand the pressure of the war and achieve victory. One of the most miraculous aspects of the 1948 war was the morale of the Israeli people. Despite the overwhelming odds and the constant threat of annihilation, the Jewish community in Israel remained resolute. The sense of unity and shared purpose was palpable. This collective determination, combined with strategic military decisions and tactical brilliance, enabled Israel to turn the tide of the war. As the weeks turned into months, Israel's military forces gained ground. They managed to push back the Arab armies and secure key territories, including areas that had been designated for the Arab state under the United Nations partition plan. By the end of the war in 1949, Israel had expanded its borders beyond those initially allocated by the UN. The international community, including both the United States and the Soviet Union, played a role in supporting Israel during the war, though their involvement was not without controversy. The US provided diplomatic recognition of Israel shortly after its declaration of independence. And while the US did not provide direct military support, there were private donations of weapons and supplies. The Soviet Union, initially critical of Israel's establishment, eventually came to support it diplomatically, partly due to its interest in gaining favor with the new state. However, the most significant international assistance came from the Jewish diaspora, particularly in the United States, where large sums of money and military supplies were raised through private initiatives. The success of Israel in 1948 was not just a military achievement, it was a triumph of the human spirit. It demonstrated the resilience of the Jewish people and their commitment to their homeland. The War of Independence laid the foundation for the modern state of Israel, and the events of 1948 have continued to shape the national consciousness of the Israeli people. For many Jews, the survival of Israel against overwhelming odds was seen as a divine act of providence, a fulfillment of the ancient promise made to the descendants of Abraham. Israel's victory in 1948 was not just a military victory, but a symbol of hope and survival. It marked the beginning of a new chapter for the Jewish people and the birth of a nation that would become a beacon of resilience in the face of adversity. Despite the hardships and challenges that lay ahead, the events of 1948 solidified Israel's place in the world and proved that, no matter the odds, the Jewish people would never again be without a homeland. Right now in Israel, the political scene feels like it's constantly shifting, and for a lot of people it's deeply unsettling. Over the past couple of years, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his government have been pushing changes to how Israel's judicial system works, changes that have triggered massive street protests, heated debates inside the Knesset, and deep disappointment from a good chunk of the public. What was once a simmering controversy has now become one of the central political dramas in Israel's modern history. Wikipedia. It all goes back to 2023 when Netanyahu's right-wing coalition first put forward a broad package of judicial reform proposals. The goal, according to Netanyahu and his allies, was to rebalance the relationship between the elected branches of government and the courts, which they felt had too much power to overturn laws and block policy decisions. Critics, however, warned from the very beginning that these changes would fundamentally weaken judicial independence, that the courts were being undermined in a way that could erode democratic checks and balances. Wikipedia. Those early proposals sparked some of the largest protests Israel had seen in decades. Tens of thousands of people took to the streets week after week, lawyers, reservists, civil servants, students, entire families marching, chanting, and demanding that the government back down. The reform movement wasn't just a fringe group, it drew people from across the political spectrum who were genuinely scared about what these changes could mean for Israel's future. Wikipedia then. In October 2023, everything changed again. A devastating attack by Hamas triggered a brutal war in Gaza, and for a time the reform battle faded into the background as headlines shifted to rockets, hostages, and wartime politics. Netanyahu's government paused the push for judicial overhaul, saying national unity and security had to come first. Many people breathed a sigh of relief, thinking the most contentious proposals were off the table or permanently shelved. Jerusalem Post. But in early 2025, the judicial reform fight came roaring back. The Knesset, now bolstered by a coalition that includes some of the most right-wing and ultra-Orthodox parties in Israel's history, voted on a key part of the plan to reshape the judiciary. The law that passed changes how judges are appointed, giving politicians far more say in who sits on the bench and weakening the influence of independent legal professionals. It passed with 67 votes in favor and a near-total boycott from opposition members, who saw the move as a blatant political power grab. Jewish Telegraphic Agency, +1 for many Israelis. That vote was a shock. It wasn't just about judges, it felt like the government was rearranging the very foundations of democracy in the middle of a war. Critics called it a blow to accountability and a way for political leaders to insulate themselves from legal scrutiny, especially since Netanyahu is facing multiple corruption charges himself. There were widespread fears that these reforms could be used to protect politicians from prosecution and to limit the court's ability to check executive power, cite Yaniv Net Global. But here's where it gets even more complicated. The public reaction didn't calm down after the vote. Instead, the protests reignited. People poured back into the streets in Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, and cities across the country, not just to oppose the judicial overhaul itself, but also to express their frustration with how the government has handled a range of issues from the ongoing war to the hostage crisis and beyond. The demonstrations have brought together a wide cross-section of society reserve soldiers, parents, lawyers, and everyday citizens who feel like Israel's democratic norms are under threat. I'll monitor. At the same time, Netanyahu's government has made moves that critics see as an attempt to neutralize independent checks on its power. The administration sought to dismiss key security and legal figures, including the head of Shin Bet, Israel's domestic intelligence agency, and the Attorney General, both of whom had been critical of government actions. These high-profile clashes have only intensified public distrust. Opponents argue that removing these officials isn't about national security or governance efficiency. It's about consolidating control and silencing institutional voices that might challenge the government's agenda. AJC supporters of the government, however, frame things very differently. They argue that Israel's judiciary has too much unchecked power and has been thwarting the will of the people as expressed through elections. They see the reforms as a way to restore what they call balance and bring democratic accountability back to where voters can feel it most. To them, the protest movement represents a vocal minority that doesn't respect the outcome of democratic elections. This divide has sliced through Israeli society, with friends and families finding themselves on opposite sides of passionate disagreements. I'll monitor another layer to this political puzzle is war. The conflict with Hamas and the broader unrest in the region have made everything more charged. Some critics point out that the government revived the judicial reform push at a moment when national unity is most needed, accusing Netanyahu of using the war to distract from judicial controversy and his own political vulnerabilities, including his corruption trials. This perception that political survival is being prioritized over national security or the humane resolution of the hostage crisis has fueled public frustration even further. AJC amid all of this, many Israelis who once supported Netanyahu find themselves disappointed. Voters who backed him for security, stability, or conservative economic policies never expected the deep rifts over judicial reform, or the relentless political battles that have dominated headlines and street rallies. For them, Israel's current turmoil feels like a distraction from real issues like housing costs, economic inequality, and the ongoing conflict's human toll. The sense of disappointment isn't just about policy disagreement, it's about a feeling that political leaders have lost sight of what keeps the country stable and focused. AJC, there's also an international dimension to this story. Israel's judicial crisis hasn't stayed a domestic issue, it's caught attention globally. Allies and democratic partners around the world have expressed concern about the implications of weakening judicial oversight, warning that such shifts could erode democratic norms. While foreign policy and war often dominate Israel's external relationships, how the country handles internal democratic structures has become a talking point in diplomatic circles as well. AJC, and yet, Netanyahu remains a powerful political operator. His coalition holds a firm majority in the Knesset, and by passing the budget, his government has secured its ability to remain in power through at least the next election cycle, slated for late 2026. Critics argue that this means the judicial reforms, once stalled, now have real momentum and could take effect unless there's a dramatic political shift. That possibility fuels both hope and fear across the political spectrum. Hope that democratic norms might be restored through future elections, but fear that current changes might be harder to reverse. Jewish Telegraphic Agency. So where does that leave Israel today? It's a nation at a crossroads. On the one hand, there's a government trying to reshape the balance of power between branches of state authority. On the other hand, there's a deeply skeptical public, millions of citizens who feel their democratic legacy is at risk. The strains of war only heighten the tension, making each political decision feel like it carries more weight. The question isn't just what laws get passed, it's what kind of country Israel wants to be in the years to come, and whether the institutions that have defined its democracy will remain strong or bend under political pressure. AL Monitor, as we wrap up today's discussion, it's important to reflect on just how significant Israel is, not just in a political sense, but also historically and spiritually. For thousands of years, Israel has been at the heart of the Jewish story. It's a land of profound importance to many, not only as a homeland, but as a symbol of resilience, hope, and faith. The history, the struggles, and the triumphs of Israel are intricately woven into the fabric of the Jewish people's journey. And today, Israel continues to play a central role in shaping the future. Whether you're drawn to its religious significance, its historical legacy, or its modern-day challenges, Israel holds a place of unparalleled importance in the hearts of many across the world. If you enjoyed this conversation and want to hear more about topics like this, feel free to like and subscribe. There's always more to explore and discuss, and we'd love to have you with us as we continue these important conversations. Thanks for joining, and see you next time.